A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I know this sounds ridiculous, but I need to tell you all about the night I realized how terrifying a seemingly ordinary family dinner could be. It all started when my youngest daughter, Lily, who's a bright, sassy 9-year-old, casually dropped a comment about her older sister, Nina, who's 16 and still single, during our meal. Now, I'm the kind of dad who believes in honesty, so when Lily said, maybe Nina is just waiting for a zombie to wake her up from her sleep, like in those awful romance movies, I chuckled nervously, hoping to diffuse any tension before it escalated. But Nina's face darkened in an instant, her eyes narrowing as if Lily's innocent jab was a personal attack, and that's when I noticed a flicker of something strange behind Nina's usually bright demeanor. It was as if a shadow passed over her, and for a brief moment, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I could see the tension rising, and trying to lighten the mood, I said, well, honey, maybe your prince just hasn't found you yet. But that only made things worse as Lily shrugged defiantly. The last prince never cared for anyone in the kingdom, he disappeared when he was supposed to show up. That's why he's not here now. I could almost feel the atmosphere shift, thickening around us like fog, as Nina's silence grew heavy and deafening. It was at that moment that my wife, Sarah, who had been silent all evening, suddenly snapped her head toward Nina and asked, "What's wrong with waiting, sweetie? Not everyone finds their person right away." For a split second, I thought Nina would say something dismissive, but instead, she leaned forward, her voice a mere whisper, as though sharing a secret. "It's not the waiting that scares me, Mom. It's the fear of waiting too long, of becoming invisible," her fingers trembling as she toyed with a loose thread on her sweater. With every word, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The sight of my little girl unraveling was a nightmare I never wished to witness, yet here we were, spiraling deeper into an unexpected darkness, with Lily oblivious to the storm brewing around her. As the conversation swayed back and forth, I noticed a flicker behind Nina's gaze, a kind of desperation that made me question what had been brewing beneath the surface. When Sarah attempted to steer the topic toward Lily's soccer practice, something in Nina snapped. She shot back, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard. "What if I don't want ordinary? What if I want something bigger than this boring life? Maybe I don't want to be a princess. Maybe I want to be left alone." I hesitated, torn between defending my daughters and probing for deeper truths, but the air had grown too tense for exploration. It felt like one wrong word could unleash chaos, and the primal instinct to protect surged through me, so I awkwardly stood before them, the silence fracturing like glass. My heart raced, wondering why simple family banter had morphed into emotional warfare so quickly. Because I had seen my children argue before, but never like this, never, with a palpable weight of sadness shadowing every picture-perfect meal shared. Then came the moment that set my nerves ablaze. Nina, choked with emotion, dashed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her, leaving only Lily, who blinked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, asking, "Did I do something wrong, Dad?" As I opened my mouth to reassure her, the sound of Nina's laughter drifted back through the hallway, but it was unlike any laugh I'd heard. It held an eerie edge that felt out of place in our home. A sickening realization dawned on me. There was a sinister overtone lurking in the shadows of what we had just witnessed, and without a clue to what sparked such resentment from my eldest. Immediately, I rushed after Nina, the chill clinging to my skin as I reached her room, only to find her door locked tight. I knocked gently, but she answered with silence thick enough to drown in. "Nina, sweetie, I'm worried. Can we talk?" And her response surprised me. "Can we talk about nothing, Dad? Because that's all this family does." Confusion reignited in me as the rattling echo of her words unsettled my mind. Did she feel trapped in our lives, or was it all the teasing about her love life haunting her like a ghost? Just as I was about to force the door open, I recalled the stories Nina had told me about her friends, how they'd all begun dating and sharing secrets, and how she felt out of place in a world that was expanding without her. The thought made my heart ache, but it never warranted this level of isolation and despair. Frantically, I turned to look for Sarah, hoping to make sense of it all, yet she stood at the end of the hall, frozen as if she'd seen a ghost. I glanced into her eyes, and I could see her grappling with emotions of her own, but before she could speak, we heard it, the muffled chanting. My blood ran cold, and I leaned in closer to hear Nina, chanting softly through the door, words flowing like a dark incantation filled with longing and resentment. "I will not be invisible, I will not be ordinary, I will rise above this life and claim what belongs to me." The chilling promise sent shivers crawling down my spine. Those were words I wouldn't let linger in this family, so I pushed the door open with force, but as the hinges creaked in protest, time warped, whatever had been waiting to pounce felt like it had slipped through a crack, and the room before me was unlike what I remembered. Flickering shadows danced against the walls, twisting and turning with sinister intent, and what stood before me was not the Nina I raised. In her place stood someone or something, a version battling for dominance, eyes gleaming with a malevolence that felt ancient. As I stumbled back, gasping for breath, I grasped for sense, realizing I wasn't just witnessing a fractured family dynamic, I was confronted by something far darker that had fed off our pain. A screech erupted from what resembled my daughter, and I stumbled back as the lights flickered violently, plunging us into a pitch-black void. I could feel the desperate energy within our walls as if the very air thickened with anger and despair, and as I tried to move, a chilling whisper escaped. I realized this wasn't about a family dinner anymore, it was about confronting the monsters that had found their way into our home, perhaps born from secrets and fears we had never dared to voice. And as I prepared to save Nina, I felt the broken shards of our perfect family crumble around me, leaving behind the echo of her chant reverberating through our lives. I will not be ordinary. When my in-laws announced their planned visit, I had mixed feelings. Their last visit had left me exhausted, and their habit of criticizing my parenting and my home loomed large in my mind, so I decided to child-proof our house even more than usual. It felt necessary, not just for my peace but also for the safety of my 3-year-old daughter, Ava, who could turn any mundane object into a weapon of chaos. I began with the basics: outlet covers, strapping the heavy bookshelf to the wall, and locking away any potentially harmful items. But as I rummaged through the cabinets for anything that might hand my in-laws an excuse to criticize, I stumbled upon an old shoebox filled with knickknacks from my childhood. Inside, I found an ornate porcelain figurine that my mother had insisted on keeping in the living room, a delicate ballet dancer with a lifted dress and pointed toes, fragile yet hauntingly beautiful. A chill ran down my spine at the thought of Ava breaking at the moment Grandma laid eyes on it. So, I tucked it away in the attic, convinced it was the responsible thing to do. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every corner, every shelf was scrutinized. I installed more baby gates than I could count and even placed breathable netting over our balcony railing. It was excessive, but I wanted to avoid the shame of an "I told you so" from my in-laws, should the worst happen. The night before their arrival, I barely slept. My mind raced, plagued by visions of what might go wrong: a splinter, a bruise, or worse, an injury. When the morning came, I was a bundle of nerves, jumping at every sound. As I sat in anxious silence with Ava, the doorbell rang. The moment my in-laws stepped inside, my stomach twisted. I could see my father-in-law's judgmental gaze scanning our living room, taking in the extra safety measures, dissecting them with quiet disdain. But a part of me felt triumphant because I felt like I'd done my part to protect my daughter. They greeted Ava with a syrupy sweetness that made me even more uneasy. As the day progressed, my in-laws prattled on about their lives in the city, how much better things were there, and I bit my tongue to hold back a million retorts about the pressures of city living. Their comments turned to parenting advice before long, filled with passive-aggressive suggestions that sent my blood pressure soaring. I steered them away from danger zones. The balcony is off-limits, because of the netting. But they insisted that Ava could handle it. And then I heard it, a soft, yet unmistakable sound from above. The attic. I felt a sense of dread wash over me. Could my daughter have found a way up? I excused myself, my heart racing, and bounded upstairs 2 steps at a time, convinced I'd find her playing among the cobwebs. The attic door creaked open, and I stepped into the dim light, expecting to find calamity awaiting. Instead, I was met only with silence. My eyes scanned the room, landing on the old shoebox, a single beam of light catching on the porcelain dancer. But when I approached, my hand brushed against a pile of items hidden beneath a dust-covered blanket, and I froze. It was personal stuff, my old toys, and also something that wasn't mine, a rusted knife, half buried beside an old doll. I recoiled, backing away, but the moment did send chills through me. Why on earth was a knife up here? Just as I took a breath to regain my composure, a loud crash echoed downstairs. I bolted down the stairs, the whisper of dread trailing behind me. Upon entering the living room, I nearly fainted. Ava sat on the floor amidst the ruins of a table lamp, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and pure delight. My in-laws were glaring at her, my mother-in-law shielding her mouth in horror as my father-in-law reached for the phone to call someone. I panicked. It's just a lamp. I practically screamed, gripping Ava as she chimed in cheerfully, obliviously proud of her little escapade. Look, Mommy, I knocked it over. But my mother-in-law wasn't done. She launched into a tirade about how I needed to control my child, the implications of an uncluttered house cutting deeper than the knife I'd found. I felt my heart racing in my chest, rage bubbling over as I snapped back, I'm just trying to keep her safe. Is that a crime? The air thickened with tension, words spilling out like toxic waste. Ava whimpered as the shouting echoed around her, turning her giggles into tears. My memory of the rusted knife clawed at me, whispering the dangers lurking in the corners of parental responsibility. The in-laws left that day under a cloud of disappointment that carried through the air like a death knell. After they left, I turned to Ava, feeling more defeated than ever. It was just a table lamp, but I could sense too much had been awakened. That night, I found myself back in the attic, drawn to the violated innocence of my childhood treasures. I didn't care that I was scaring myself, I needed to understand why someone would have hidden that knife. As I pulled the doll from the pile, I was unprepared for the sight of something I'd never noticed before, stitched into the fabric, a single word in fading thread, help. The letters blurred together until a memory from so long ago slapped me in the face. It was my mother's warning, a phrase I hadn't thought about since childhood, a nondescript caution about strangers, but I had dismissed it then, just as I had dismissed the weird unease my in-laws always stirred within me. Parental instincts, they say, are born through fear, but I realized my fear ran deeper this time. The knife, the warnings, the porcelain dancer, it all fit into a secret puzzle of silence that I thought had been long forgotten. Suddenly, the mundane act of child-proofing my house felt like a wake-up call to a monstrous reality. I climbed back down, determined but unnerved. Nothing else mattered now, I had to protect Ava. The old fears returned in waves, whispering the awful truth that sometimes, the real dangers come not from our children, but from the shadows we inadvertently bring into our lives. And as I stood guard at Ava's bedroom door that night, listening to her soft breathing, I felt the eerie sensation of being watched, as if the shadows were deliberating, waiting for an opportunity to rise. The next time my in-laws planned a visit, I'd have to make a choice. Would I child-proof against the world, or would I prepare for the secrets that hid behind the look of disappointment on their faces? I hesitated before hitting the send button, my phone trembling in my sweaty palm as I stared at the message I wrote to my aunt, the woman who had been the thorn in my side for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of relative who offered unsolicited advice and criticized every aspect of my life, from my choice of career to my wardrobe, but when she insisted on coming to my house for my birthday dinner, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. It was supposed to be a day for celebration, a day to enjoy with my friends and family, and instead, the evening turned into a twisted family therapy session where I was dissected like a frog in biology class, her sharp tongue skewering my self-esteem. After an hour of her cutting remarks, I snapped, my patience evaporating like water on a hot day, and I blurted out, "I'll never be good enough for you, will I?" All her laughter and condescension stopped, replaced with an icy silence, and for a moment, I reveled in the satisfaction that came from bringing her down a peg. However, that satisfaction was fleeting and morphed into a sick dread when her expression shifted into something unreadable, as if she had just discovered a hidden truth that had lain dormant for years. The silence stretched heavily between us, wrapping the entire room in a smothering shroud, and when my best friend, Mark, attempted to lighten the mood with a joke, laughter just seemed to echo awkwardly around the table, hardly concealing the tension. My aunt finally spoke, her voice low and slow, like molasses oozing out of a jar. "You should really go to your room, dear," she said, and I let out a nervous laugh, thinking she was joking, but her eyes glinted with a mixture of anger and something else that sent a shiver down my spine. I could practically feel the echoes of my words hanging in the air, thick and cloying, as I excused myself and retreated to my room, the walls creeping closer as if they were eavesdropping. It was hours before I heard the sounds of the dinner party winding down, loud chatter interspersed with laughter from Mark that felt far away, an island of normalcy in a sea of dread, but even the laughter couldn't drown out the gnawing in my gut that told me I had crossed a line. When the door creaked open, it was my mother standing there, her face pale. "Your aunt wants to talk to you," she said quietly, and I could see the worry etched on her features. I moved reluctantly, every step weighed down with foreboding until I stepped into the living room, where my aunt sat stiffly on the edge of the couch as if she were so wound up that she might snap. I could feel my heart race, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay, my eyes glued to her, and then she leaned forward, her voice now barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for our family, do you?" I opened my mouth to protest, to ground her words in some semblance of reality, but I was struck dumb by the raw intensity in her gaze. It was as if she were peering into my soul, dissecting all my hidden insecurities, and in a volcanic eruption of emotions that I couldn't control, she admitted something I never saw coming. Her upbringing had been a nightmare. The house was filled with whispers and shadows of unspoken things, and I had been too naive to notice. For what felt like hours, she unraveled the threads of her own pain, stories of family betrayals and lost loves, everything meeting the gnashing of teeth and the silent screams of the night. I wanted to comfort her, but the more she spoke, the more disoriented I became, ideas of comfort clashing with the venomous way she treated me, and in this warped tapestry of her life, I saw reflection, not just of herself, but a reflection of how she viewed me, as a failure with no hope in her eyes. When she finally fell silent, I stood frozen, the weight of this revelation heavy on my chest as I struggled to find the words to fill the void that had opened between us. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but there was something fractured in her expression. She gazed at me with an intensity I couldn't fathom, and just below the surface, I sensed her disappointment, a flicker of pain that ignited into a wildfire. She leaned closer, seemingly brimming with a need to impart her final lesson. "You must understand, it's not about being good enough, it's about survival. Life is unforgiving, and if you can't understand that, then you have no hope." At that moment, I felt a shiver ripple across my spine. It felt like a threat wrapped in wisdom, a chilling portent of what awaited me beyond the confines of this moment. My pulse quickened, and as I stumbled backward, I could feel that same creeping sensation that had haunted me since I was a child. I turned and fled upstairs, shutting the door behind me, pushing my back against it as if barricading myself against her presence. But the moment I felt safe, the shadows in my room shifted, flickering like candlelight, and I whimpered at the encroaching darkness. It wasn't until later, curled under my soft blanket, that I heard the muffled echoes of conversation between my mother and my aunt downstairs, their voices entwined like two serpents fighting for dominance, until I finally embarked on the road to sleep, where night after night, my dreams morphed into nightmares, my aunt's words haunting me like a sinister refrain, repeating over and over until they carved grooves into my mind, sometimes morphing her face into something monstrous that loomed over me. Days bled into weeks, and while my aunt eventually left, the tension never quite dissipated. I found myself looking over my shoulder as if at any moment her icy presence would return to taunt me, the weight of our conversation still thick and oppressive, suffocating the air around me. And then the dreams grew darker, twisting into something grotesque, her voice echoing with the laughter of children, mocking me while I went untouched, trapped in a glass box that no one else could see. And during those nights, I found myself screaming for my mom, reaching for the warmth of the real world, but she couldn't hear me. I started to notice subtle shifts too, small things like objects moving in my periphery, shadows stretching in ways that defied reason, and an uneasiness burrowing itself in my bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest. That sense of dread culminated on a particularly stormy night when a crack of thunder shook my room awake and I looked up to see someone standing in the shadows, the silhouette barely detectable in the darkness. But just as I was about to convince myself it was a trick of the light, I recognized the warm outline of my aunt. Her expression twisted into something terrible, smiling cruelly, a manifestation of my own fears given flesh, and in that instant, I finally understood the words she'd said. They weren't merely warnings or lessons, they were a curse set to ensnare my soul. I bolted up from my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal, frantically scrambling for the light switch that ultimately betrayed me by turning on with an unsettling flicker. Yet there was no sign of her. The room was empty but still suffused with that same malignant energy, and I collapsed onto my bed in a heap of raw nerves, unable to process what I'd just experienced. Over the next few weeks, my mental state unraveled. I found myself questioning reality, my own perceptions morphing into a living nightmare, and as the sun filtered through my window, scattering light across my face, it felt like every shadow carried a dagger aimed straight at my heart, until one night, as desperation clawed violently at the edges of my mind, I confronted my mother, voice trembling. I expressed my fears, told her what I had seen, but her face mirrored only disbelief, and that made it worse. She didn't understand. She thought I was merely acting out, a child unwilling to accept the terms of adulthood. It felt as though my words floated into a void, unheard and uncared for, and that's when I realized I had no one to turn to. Weeks became months, my studies suffered, friendships strained, and the isolation consumed me, until one evening when I finally broke down, throwing a glass against the wall, the shards littering my room like fragments of my crumbling sanity. I wished I had been kinder to my aunt, wished I hadn't shouted at her, but wishful thinking morphed into deafening silence as I stood amidst the wreckage, trying to fathom my spiraling demise. Then it hit me, a radical thought that filled me with dread and clarity all at once. What if her curse was digging its claws deeper and deeper with each passing day? My mind was a battlefield of frantic thoughts. Maybe she was right all along. I was destined to be a failure. I could feel it in every shaky breath, every restless night, and one desperate line of hope strung tight in my heart. I needed to confront her, unleash whatever darkness she had thrust upon me. So, without thinking, I dialed her number, each ring like a countdown to an inevitable reckoning, and when she picked up, that familiar sing-song voice filled the air. "Hello, dear." I could hear the sweet undercurrent of condescension wrapping itself around her words, and I steeled myself, daring to confront my fears. "What did you do to me?" I managed to choke out, the words tumbling raw and unhinged, but there was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought I had lost her, and then she laughed, a chilling sound that echoed down my spine like icy fingers tracing my vertebrae. "Oh honey, that was just the beginning," she said, and I realized, right then, what terrible sacrifice she had made. No, not for the family, but to ensure that I would carry the burden of her darkness, a parasite feeding off my mistakes. With every accusation I hurled at her now, I felt smaller, more defeated. She fed off my fear, reshaping it into something twisted and wholly her own, until finally, with one last mocking laugh, she hung up, leaving me holding a phone in a vice grip as silence enveloped me, and just as the last flicker of hope threatened to evaporate, I realized something. I wasn't the one who had been cast aside, but I would be the one who would have to break the cycle, and with that ephemeral thought, everything narrowed into sharp focus. Bursts of determination surging through my veins. She could no longer control me, and while the haunting laughter lingered, a defiant fire ignited in my stomach. Just like the day I stood up for myself with words that chafed but were necessary, I would unravel her grip, confront every shadow, and refuse to be her puppet anymore. AITA for what I said to my aunt? Yes, perhaps. But what I'll do next, how I choose to take ownership of my life from here on out? That's the real question, isn't it? It's time to rise from the ashes she left behind. I never thought I'd be the one caught in a tug-of-war over life and death, but when my father chose to prioritize his fiancée's surgery over my own, I couldn't help but feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. The moment I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, everything spiraled from familiarity to sheer panic. My required surgery was life or death, an urgent fix to a ticking time bomb inside me. My dad, who had always been both my rock and my tormentor, became distant as soon as his new fiancée entered the picture, an almost cartoonish figure with a flashy smile and an obsession with yoga that somehow transformed my father from the caring dad I remembered into an oblivious shell wrapped around her every whim. I still remember the day it all shattered. I had been staring at the sterile hospital ceiling with its bright lights flickering like the last breaths of hope when my father strolled in, a confident grin plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, shattering my concentration. "Diane finally got the necessary approval for her surgery. It's next week." My heart raced, not from excitement, because I knew my surgery was also scheduled for next week, meant to save me from the darkness lurking within. I stared at him, mouth dry and words tangled in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and anger. "What about my surgery, Dad?" I asked, my voice a tremor against the cold efficiency of the room. All he could muster was a casual wave of his hand, a gesture that felt like a dismissive slap to my very existence. "Summer, sweetie, Diane needs this. It's a tough procedure, and I want to be there for her." At that moment, it dawned on me that I was no longer the priority in his life. His fiancée was the one who needed nurturing, love, attention, everything I had hoped my father would give me as I faced the specter of death. The reality hit me like 1,000 tiny hammers. He chose her over me, and I felt discarded, like a broken toy with no real value. I spent the days leading up to my surgery in limbo, wondering how blood could run thicker than water when mere affection had suddenly paled in comparison to a woman who gained my father's affection only recently. I didn't understand how he could be so blind, so utterly subsumed by her charm that he neglected the urgency of what was at stake, his own flesh and blood. On the day of the operation, nurses wheeled my gurney down the long, sterile hall, and as I passed the waiting area, I spotted him. He sat there, hand clasped over hers, laughing at something she said, laughing at the uncertainties of life, completely oblivious to my imminent fate. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not with fear of the surgery but with rage and betrayal. They were just at the other end of the hallway, and as I was rolled on by, the moment felt like a goodbye, like I was surrendering myself to the uncertain void, pushed aside for someone who had only stepped into the picture months before. I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, feeling as though I had been torn from one world and thrown into another. Dazed, I scanned the room, hoping against hope to see my dad. Instead, only an empty chair remained. I called out to a nurse, my voice cracking, feeling abandoned and lost, needing comfort, just wanting to know I mattered, that I was worth fighting for. She offered a sympathetic smile and squeezed my hand gently. "He's with Diane, dear. She had a complication in her procedure." Those words struck me like a thunderous drum, the realization that I could have been lying in a casket, my father by her side, his heart beating for her while mine lay cold. The pain morphed inside me. It was no longer just physical but a fiery bitterness. I didn't care how selfish I sounded, I was allowed to feel anger at the man who chose someone else over his own daughter. Days merged together, and every time I found the strength to look for my dad, he was still there with her, spinning tales of shared laughter while I lay bruised and silent in the hospital. When we finally spoke, I confronted him, my emotions overflowing like a flood, raw and unrestrained. "You chose her, Dad. You chose her over me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You took her side, and I was alone." The silence that followed was the sharpest knife through my heart. A slow realization washed over him, but all I saw reflected back was disbelief. "No, it wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "You're my daughter. You know that." But the words rang hollow, echoes drifting into the void where our bond had once thrived. I left the hospital feeling like I had lost more than my father. I had lost the last semblance of family I clung to, my will to fight diminished by someone who never cared to unravel the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and news of Diane's shaky recovery filled my dad's voice every chance he got while still making excuses for his absence in my life. When I learned she was finally stabilized, I confronted my dad one last time. "You have to make a choice," I whispered, my heart racing as adrenaline coursed through me. "It's either me or her. You can't have both, not while I'm fighting for my life and she's taking everything from me." His face paled, and for the first time, I saw clarity in him, as if my words had finally threaded through the fog surrounding his mind. But instead of answering, he looked away, avoiding my gaze, and my heart shattered all over again. It was then I realized, the true betrayal wasn't his choice to love someone else, it was a choice he would always make, to love her more. Walking away from him that day felt like my own funeral, a weight lifting from my chest as I stepped into the cold air, a marionette severed from its strings. So, yeah, AITA for telling my dad he made a choice between me and his fiancée when he prioritized her surgery over mine? I don't think so. I just wanted him to see that he wasn't the only one who knew what it felt like to stand at the crossroads of life, and without him there to choose me, I simply had to learn to choose myself. It was a rainy Saturday morning, and the small coffee shop on the corner was packed, mirroring the storm outside with its chaotic energy. I managed to snag the last table, a tiny two-seater with a view of the dripping city streets, just as the door swung open to let in a gust of wind and a figure I would soon come to regret. She stumbled in, a wild-haired woman in a tattered raincoat, her face obscured by a tangle of frizzy curls, and for an instant, everything around me fell silent. She hovered in the doorway like some tragic specter. I caught a whiff of her as she approached the counter to order, and it hit me like a brick wall: sweat, rot and something I couldn't quite place, a medley of unkempt days stacked one atop the other like trash piling up in a back alley. I instinctively retracted my shoulders, suddenly hyper-aware of the people left standing in the queue, but they all wore expressions of discomfort, mirroring my own. Every instinct told me to maintain my distance. Her essence intruded upon the coffee shop's warm, cinnamon-tinged ambience. I was already watching people navigate between the tables, searching for a place to sit, and as I sipped cautiously on my overly sweet vanilla latte, I hoped she would find a corner where her smell wouldn't reach me. But life is never that simple. She approached my table, draped her coat over the back of the chair opposite me, and smiled a toothy grin that felt more like a warning than anything else. "Is this seat taken?" she chirped, and the pit in my stomach deepened as the aroma clung to the air around us, a thick, suffocating blanket that made my brain scream for escape. I wanted to be polite, to tell her I was waiting for someone, but the words caught in my throat, twisted by the harsh reality of her scent clinging to every surface. Instead, I cleared my throat, forcing a strained smile. "Actually, I'm just waiting for a friend," I replied, emphasizing the word friend like it was a sacred charm. She blinked and leaned in closer, the stench intensifying as if she had inhaled all the miseries of the world and exhaled them right in my direction. "Oh, come on, there's no need for that," she said, her voice a strange mix of persistence and desperation that instantly spat in the face of my discomfort. "It's a crowded place, just a quick sit until they find a seat." I felt my throat tighten further. I wanted to rise like a ghost, but the warmth of the latte paled in comparison to the cold, invading anxiety clawing at my chest. I could feel the eyes around us narrow in scrutiny, silently judging me, and I knew that I had to stand my ground because the alternative was unthinkable. I shook my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm sorry, but I really can't. I need some space." The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the whole cafe held its breath, waiting for her reaction. Her expression shifted from surprise to something darker, a flicker of indignation igniting beneath the surface of her frazzled exterior. "You're really going to turn me away? Just because of how I smell?" she hissed, her voice dropping low yet piercing, echoing between tables, punctuated by the clinking of mugs and muted chatter that seemed to suddenly fade into mere background noise. My chest tightened, caught between a wave of guilt and the suffocating dread of being captured by her discomfort. I wanted to scream to the world that I wasn't the bad guy here, that this wasn't about her as a person, that my senses were fighting a losing battle against her reality. But it was too late. In her narrowed eyes, I saw the slow dawning realization that I might be one of the few people refusing to let her presence invade their space. She sat back, huffing, shoulders slumping, tail between her legs. I could tell she felt it, the weight of her own isolation, the lack of kindness in an unfriendly world, but I was drowning, gasping for clean air. That's when she leaned forward again, eyes alight with something indefinable, an unsettling spark swirling behind them. "You know, there's a name for people like you. They call you made of money and you turn your back on someone who just needs to rest. You won't remember this moment, you'll move on with your perfect, clean life while I'm left here in the dirt you won't even acknowledge." I braced myself for a possible outburst, but every moment of tension bent its spine back upon itself, wrapping the room in an atmosphere thick with anticipation. I wanted to hurl my guilt at her, to explain that I didn't have a perfect life, I had bills that made me sweat in my sleep and deadlines that haunted me. But her words cut deeper, and I found myself staring down into my latte, the froth swirling like crowded thoughts in my mind as shame crept over me like a thief in the night. "I'm not the bad guy here," I attempted to insist, voice trembling with uncertainty and helplessness, but I was drowning in her eyes, the raw emotion behind them flaying the fabric of my justification. Then, slowly, she straightened, mouth a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't the laughter of someone who found joy, it was the brittle kind that echoed of deep wounds and ancient hurts that made me wonder how often had she been ridiculed in this very way. Anger flared briefly at the edge of my thoughts, casting shadows of self-doubt into the void. Was I really the monster I'd been painted to be? The onlookers shifted in discomfort. It appeared to be a performance now, a spectator's sport of empathy versus survival. The barista even paused as she made cappuccinos, casting sideways glances at us as the mayhem unfolded. I wish I could have shrunk down into the woven fabric of the chair, to escape the twisted narrative taking form. "You know what," she said finally, a dangerous confidence threading her voice, "you might think you're better than me now, but if you saw what I saw, if you felt what I feel, you'd run screaming into the night." My stomach churned as her words slithered into my mind, sharp and sinuous, and I did not want to imagine. We were worlds apart, yet standing in the same coffee shop, and I wasn't proud of the thoughts rolling through my head, thoughts that toyed with my sanity, testing the limits of my own humanity. I could hear my heart pounding within the petrified silence, the air thick as if the rain outside had seeped into our souls. "Every interaction matters," she hissed, leaning closer still, unyielding. I held my breath, feeling myself unravel, wishing for the comfort of ignorance, and just when I thought it couldn't get worse, she added, "You think you understand what hell smells like, don't you?" The way she said it settled into my mind, twisting something deep inside me that tasted like regret and fear. I suddenly feared she could see through my facade, peel back my parameters and expose all that lay in ruin beneath. I was just about to protest, to shove her back into the abyss she claimed to know so intimately when, without a moment's warning, her left hand moved with precision to her coat pocket. Instinctually, I shrank back, my heart racing, wondering what she could possibly produce from that tangle of fabric. But then a glint caught the light, and in the size of an instant, I realized it was a small brass key, the kind you might find in an old hotel room. "You know, ever since I showed up, you have been hating this moment," she whispered fiercely. But I could set you free, you know? I keep the worst of them at bay, all you have to do is ask. My gaze darted around the coffee shop, searching desperately for a sign of absurdity, for anyone to back me, but their eyes had diverted, and I was left tethered to this strange, grim pact looming at the fringes of sanity. What are you talking about? I challenged, although I sounded more confused than defiant. She leaned closer still, and I felt the unmistakable sting of desperation and danger weaving through the air. I know people think I smell bad, but you don't understand. There are demons where you can't see, they cling to people who let them in. I've held them back. You don't have to live with that fear. I shook my head, shifting back in my chair, but she moved closer until her breath grazed my face. Let me show you. I couldn't shake the sensation sprinting up my spine, her hand twitched like it was beckoning me to reach out. Then it was as if the world around us fell away, like I was in a dark vessel with no exit, feeling hovering eyes that weighed heavy upon my back. The scent, the woman, everything converged into a living nightmare before it struck me how wretchedly hopeless I felt. Was it wrong to reject her? Was I complicit in her suffering? The air was thick with a bittersweet kind of tension, like looking in the mirror and not recognizing who stared back. And in that fleeting moment, I could hear whispers creeping down the edges of reality, muddying the waters of my sanity. You could run, she was saying, but wouldn't you be curious? Wouldn't you want to know what you push away, what you so readily abandon in your comfortable life? Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to refuse, to go back to my latte and the momentary safety of shallow pleasantries, but I felt something else kindle inside me. I leaned slightly closer, just a breath as I murmured, "What do I need to do?" The laughter returned, twisted and sharp, but then her expression shifted, and she froze, eyes glimmering with sanity and chaos interspersed. Nothing, really. Just acknowledge what is around you. Just for one moment. And then in that celebrated whiplash, I gasped as she broke into a wide grin and suddenly the cafe fell silent. I twisted my head around like a puppet on strings to see what lay behind me, but there wasn't anything there, just the reflective glass that taunted my confusion. Your demons are real, but they take many shapes, she continued, voice low and mesmerizing, and in that immored feeling, the vibrations of anxiety raced up my throat. The key suddenly felt immensely heavy in her hand, like it was holding a world I couldn't comprehend. Acknowledge them, and you might find what really haunts you isn't me at all. And just like that, a shiver coursed up my spine, underlining the unsettling reality that perhaps I shouldn't have pushed her away, perhaps I would walk out of this coffee shop and carry her stench with me, her essence following, wrapped around my neck like a noose tightening with every breath. What turned from laughter shifted back to suspicion again, and the weight of the moment crashed down, but it was too late. I was scared, held captive by the disconcerting truth behind my own choices, and as the crowd connected with fleeting uncertainty, this woman, in her tattered raincoat, had opened the door to something buried deep within. Darkness doesn't require permission, it just waits in the shadows, waiting to devour you whole while you dismiss those looking for refuge, blurring the lines between safety and fear. I straightened, the coffee shop's familiarity almost gone, as her stormy eyes implored me to see beyond my aversion. And deep down, as the rain thrummed against the windows and people shifted in their chairs, I realized I might have made a choice in that moment, a choice that I would come to reckon with long after we parted ways. The coffee shop could never provide the safety I craved, only a fleeting mask over hidden truths. My heart raced in anticipation of what lay beyond, and I suddenly needed more than just my latte. I needed to discover the depths of those demons lurking just out of sight, ready to carve a path I wouldn't soon forget. I always thought the engagement ring my grandmother bequeathed to me was just a family heirloom, sparkling with history and nostalgic whispers of love, but ever since her funeral, it transformed into something else entirely, something sinister. When she passed away, my mother sobbed uncontrollably, clutching at her heart as if it might burst from grief. Amidst the echoes of mourning, I received the delicate ring, an intricate weave of gold, encrusted with a single brilliant diamond that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own under the flickering chapel lights. For days, I kept it hidden in a small velvet pouch in my drawer, overwhelmed by not just the weight of loss, but the sense of obligation that accompanied such a treasured legacy. My mother, however, started dropping hints about how it rightfully belonged to her, how it was part of our family's bloodline, and how I shouldn't keep it for myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the ring was meant for me, and the fiery tug-of-war between familial loyalty and personal desire only intensified when I put it on. I swear I could hear my grandmother's voice whispering to me in the silence of my lonely room, coaxing me to protect it, to honor it. Then, the odd things began to happen. Shadows stretched across my walls, dark fingers creeping along the edges of my vision when I was alone at night, and every time I caught a glance of my reflection while wearing the ring, I felt a stranger staring back at me, but with my grandmother's warm smile creeping into her lips. My mother grew more frantic, restless, even desperate, and I began to piece together a darker story, one where the ring was a vessel for my grandmother's spirit, fiercely protective and unyielding. A week later, in a feverish dream, I found myself sitting at an enormous old table surrounded by flickering candles. My grandmother sat across from me, her smile soothing yet demanding. "This is your responsibility now," she said, her voice echoing off the walls like a forgotten lullaby, and even in the dream realm, I could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing against my chest. I woke up sweating, the ring still settling into the cool, clammy skin of my finger, a reminder that whatever this was, it flowed far deeper than a mere inheritance. It was legacy, it was obligation, it was power. My mother, however, had a darker intention. She wasn't just mourning, she was scheming, obsessively trying to reclaim the ring as if snuffing out my claim would sever some invisible link to our family's history. Anxiety gripped me, twisting my thoughts into frenzied knots. Who did I trust? Weeks dragged on, and I felt the shadow of my grandmother's spirit wrapping tighter around me as whispers morphed into bolder calls for protection. One night, she was more vivid than ever, her voice an intoxicating melody laced with urgency. "It's not safe anymore," she warned, making me question what I'd stumbled into. Paranoid and restless, I began to notice my mother getting darker, her mood shifting inconsistently like a thunderstorm churning in the distance, and the way she looked at me began to shift, from concern to an unsettling intensity that made cold trickles dance down my spine. I told her I would not give back the ring, and the clash between us felt like a rift splitting through the very fabric of our family. It was on that night, amid the hazy air of our argument, that the electrical hum of energy crackled, and the lights flickered as if my grandmother's spirit was the very essence fueling the atmosphere. My mother's voice darkened, exposing a bitter undercurrent intertwined with anger and sorrow, revealing that she believed I was chosen to carry a curse rather than a blessing. A bone-chilling laugh erupted from her throat, twisting my insides into knots, an echo I'd never encountered before. That night, sleep was a distant memory as dread gnawed at my gut, yet finally, exhausted and restless, I slipped into slumber sometime after dawn, prompting my mind to play tricks on me as I entered a world where the walls swirled like shadows. My dreams morphed, becoming grotesque and vivid, filled with whispers like a low hum echoing around a cavernous chamber, the very essence of my grandmother enveloping me, melding past and future. I saw visions of my mother, filled with rage and desperation, lunging for the ring that sat snugly on my finger, and with each harrowing vision, the weight of her fury clawed at my insides. When morning finally arrived, a surge of dread spiraled down my spine, pushing me to confront the reality that lay ahead. I ventured downstairs only to find the house still as a grave, and the air felt thick with an unsettling tension, the remnants of the argument hanging heavy like fog. I reached for the delicate ring only to find it had vanished from my nightstand, and panic gripped me. Where could it be? My heart thudded violently as I trudged through the house, searching high and low until I stumbled into my mother's dimly lit study. In the center of the room stood my mother, clutching the ring with feather-light fingers, a manic glimmer alight in her eyes that sent my heart racing and my defenses rising. "You don't understand, do you?" she hissed, her voice woven with a cunning that chilled my bones. I was taken aback, every part of me screamed to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but the air between us crackled with an energy that felt almost ancient. Within her eyes, I glimpsed something dark, and suddenly the realization hit, and I understood the truth. It was more than just a ring, it was a battleground for our grandmother's spirit, a catalyst seeking to protect what once was, sparring between desire and duty, life and death. But before I could grasp the weight of that revelation, my mother raised her hands, clutching the ring like a talisman, refusing to accept its rightful fate. In that moment, the temperature in the room plunged, and a shadow loomed behind her, clearer than day. It was my grandmother, her face twisted in indignation, furious that we were tearing ourselves apart over something that was supposed to symbolize love. Everything spiraled out of control in that tense standoff, voices growing louder, breaths quickening, and as my mother let out a primal scream, the ring began to tremble as the spectral figure flared to life, her voice deafening, filled with a tidal wave of anguish and fury. "Release it to the one who knows the truth." "It was never yours to take," she declared, and just like that, amidst a whirlwind of emotions, the house began to shake violently, glasses shattering while chaos reigned, leaving me standing there, the weight of decision crashing down like a tidal wave, because in that moment, I realized it wasn't about giving back the ring, it was about reclaiming the love it represented and making a choice. So no, I didn't give back the engagement ring. I chose to embrace the echoes of my family's love, to acknowledge what my grandmother whispered through the void, where grief and fear dance hand in hand. And eventually, it became clear, some inheritances are a burden, but they also shine a profound light on who we choose to become amid the chaos, though the shadows still linger, and I wonder if the whispers will ever truly fade. I need to share something that happened to me recently, and let me tell you, it's been haunting me ever since. I, 24, male, was living with my roommate, Sarah, 22, female, in an apartment that came with limited parking spaces, so we both had a parking pass we needed to display to keep our vehicles safe from being towed. Now, at first, everything seemed fine, but it didn't take long for Sarah's behavior to change. Picture this, every night she'd come home late, sometimes after midnight, after what she said were long shifts at her second job, which I didn't mind until I started noticing that she was leaving her car parked without the pass displayed, even though I'd reminded her at least a dozen times. The first time I noticed it, I told her to park in our designated spot and put the pass up. She waved me off, claiming she would handle it, but as weeks turned into months, the same pattern played out, her car would sit there, vulnerable and ominously unchecked. I think deep down I knew that ignoring the rules and parking without a pass was what made her feel rebellious, but the threat of a tow loomed over both our heads, and I started to get anxious every time I saw her vehicle in its usual spot without the pass, yet when I confronted her, she'd brush me off like I was the unreasonable one. It escalated the night I saw a tow truck pulling into the lot. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. I could see the driver scanning for offenders, and a chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the hallway. I had a choice to make. I won't lie, I mentally calculated the consequences for both of us, lose her car or confront her again, but knowing Sarah, I could picture her obnoxious eye rolling every time I brought it up, so in that moment, I made the decision. I followed that tow truck. Through the glass door, I watched as they got out and approached her car. My heart raced as I jogged down the stairs, desperate to stop them, but it was already too late. They had it lifted off the ground, and in that moment, I felt a pitiful mix of satisfaction and impending regret. I'd done what I thought was right, but the backlash I anticipated didn't take long to arrive. The next morning, I woke up to find Sarah standing over me, her face pale with anger, and she wasted no time accusing me of being the sole reason her car was gone. I tried to explain how many times I had warned her, how this was purely a consequence of her choices, but she kept accusing me of sabotaging her life and ruining her independence. She even went as far as saying I was taking pleasure in her misfortune. I told her that if she had just followed the rules, we wouldn't be here. That evening, her attempts at getting her car back only compounded her frustration when she learned that her parking pass had been revoked as well. In her fury, she vowed to make my life miserable, and I didn't take her seriously until the creepy stuff started happening. She'd come home late and drop heavy items on the floor to wake me up, blasting music with absurdly loud bass to keep me from sleeping, and I'd find my refrigerator contents rearranged or the dishes dirty when I'd cleaned them just the day before. I thought I was being paranoid until one night, while I was curled up trying to block out the noise with my headphones, I heard her whispering outside my door, saying my name in this eerie sing-song voice that sent chills through my spine. It was as if she was summoning something sinister. I confronted her about it, but she just laughed, saying she was testing my sanity. That was when I began noticing odd occurrences. One of my PS4 games went missing, only to later appear in her room, and when I asked her what it was doing there, she merely shrugged and claimed it found its way. Friends on social media started checking in on me, asking why I looked so tired all the time, and I eventually began sleeping at a friend's house after noticing that she would watch me while I slept, her eyes glimmering strangely in the darkness. I figured I would come clean to anyone that would listen about the awful situation, but my friends thought I was the weird one. I felt isolated, trapped in an apartment that now seemed haunted by her twisted perspective. The turning point came weeks later when I found out that an old mutual friend of ours went missing after reaching out to Sarah, claiming they needed to talk. I immediately tried to talk to her about it, but she just dismissed my concerns, telling me it had nothing to do with her. It was then, in a panic, I decided to check her texts and discovered that she had sent cryptic messages about someone transcending and being free along with a strange timestamp that mirrored the night my friend disappeared. My gut told me something sinister had happened, but the moment she caught me snooping, it was like unleashing Pandora's box. The next day, I woke up to find my belongings trashed. Somehow she snuck in during the night, and I panicked. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the battery was dead. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized it was only a matter of time before she would come back, and based on what I saw in her texts, I knew I had to escape before my life turned into a living nightmare. The following night, I snuck out, clutching a single duffel bag, but when I reached the parking lot, I was greeted by the harrowing sight of her car parked, with the driver's seat illuminated, even though this time she was nowhere to be seen. I hesitated, but the only way I knew I could protect myself was to leave, so I bolted to my car, only to be peppered by a deafening laughter echoing back from the direction of the apartment. Never have I felt terror like that, knotting through my stomach as I drove through the night, and even now, weeks later, I keep looking over my shoulder, paranoid that she followed me or that somehow, I've let something dark linger, but I still wonder if I went too far by getting her car towed, regardless of whatever captivating madness her psyche had devolved into, and the looming question remains, was I the villain in this twisted tale, or just a victim entangled in a nightmare? When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex, and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo? She said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. You really think a little boundary will save you? This is not just your house, this is our family, dear, she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal. Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. "Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene?" It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love.